Chapter 11. The Hammer of the Sun. There was no way now their presence could be concealed from the gate. It grew before them as they trudged along the snowbound hills above the great river's southern shore. From a notch of gray between hummocks of white to the great crowned ridge that Elof knew only too well. Rock, riding as ever at his side, spat and cursed. But as they drew closer, coming out of the hills onto open plains, frosty and snow-sprinkled, they agreed that its aspect seemed to have changed again, though clearly there was no dragon coiled around its crown now. The gray walls seemed to glisten blue in the sun, as if filmed with ice, and above them there was snow, thick crests of white crowning every roof, outlining every rail, every balustrade, every plinth, picking them out clearly so that each man of the army could see, even at this distance, the towering strength of the stronghold they must face. Ilse whistled and turned to the chief of her Duergar. "Not so bad for man's work, eh, Geary?" His dark eyes scanned the ridge, and he rubbed his flat-chinned jaw. "Man's work, and ours, I guess, in days when such things were. Long in the breaching, long in the undermining. Months, perhaps." "Time is Loki's servant," remarked Kermorven, "but I doubt if she will leave us free to try either. If we are to besiege that burg, we must first get by." He stopped and reined in his warhorse. From somewhere ahead of them, the high gate, or near it, a weird sound arose. A deep, pulsing rattle, rhythmical as a heartbeat, and beneath it, a soft, roaring note, hollow and thunderous, that rose and fell upon the bitter wind, but never quite faded. Elof could not for the life of him identify it, and to judge from the excited comments he heard from Kermorven's guard, neither could anyone else. "Like a heartbeat, hey? But try. More like a hammering." "Like breath," said a nervous voice. "Another bloody monster, panting for air." "Flapping its wings." Ilse snorted. "Might be some kind of an engine, maybe." "Aye," said Rock fiercely. "A huge water wheel, bigger than the master smith's even. What deviltry's she about up there?" But Kermorven made no answer. He was gazing around him with furrowed brow, considering the scene, looking across the open space to where it dropped away, no longer to cliffs, but onto the steep slopes leading down to the chain of deep lakes that flowed from the Gate Falls. A cold gleam came into his eyes then, and a wry smile. He frowned once more and called to one of his captains. "Have the Raven Chieftain come to me." He turned back to the others. "I was going to say, we must get by her defenders, and if I mistake not, this heralds their coming. The Ravens cannot, or will not say how many there are, save that there are more than us, which is not hard to believe." Even as he spoke, the sound faded away altogether. The sudden silence quivered like a tautened wire. He thought for a moment, then gestured to another captain. "Sound the halt. Then the battle order. See them formed up. Send out the rest of the scouts. We go no further in marching order. It's too vulnerable. We'll give battle while we're still in the open, not among Loki's hills." The horns sang in strident discord through the ranks, and the long serpentine columns halted, broke, and began to cluster together on the plain, gathering slowly into a series of concentric rings, so wide they covered more than half the plain. For a time, all was chaos, horns signaling, men shouting, horses neighing. For although the 20,000 of Karis had all seen some campaigning, they had less experience of the tight and flexible formations that Kermorven demanded. Foreseeing this, he had had to divide his own well-trained men, weaken their dependable lines to leaven the mix, and pass on as much of their knowledge as they could on the march. He took his stand with his captains and friends upon a rocky eminence atop a low rise of ground. With the many banners of the two armies floating above his head, he was easily visible as a pillar of calm above the milling masses, one moment conferring urgently with captains and nobles, the next calling cool orders that disposed one group or another about the lines, or set another to scraping shallow breastworks out of the hardened ground. But those close to him saw how his mouth worked, and how closely he scanned the hillsides for any signal from the scouts. "What ails you, my long lad?" demanded Ilse. "You've seen bad battles enough in your day." "I had never loved a single one of them," retorted Kermorven grimly, "but least of all one in which I am doomed to hang back, to command thousands to spill their blood before I so much as risk any drop of my own." He turned sharply as a Raven chieftain struggled through the melee and hailed him with grim respect, raising spear and shield. "Hiya! Where will you have the ravens perch?" Kermorven lifted a hand. "Gather them below the hillock there, where you can hear me." The old man eyed him a moment. "I thought he will place us in the front line, that his foes may seem to strike against themselves." He paused doubtfully. "Clan has fought clan often enough. It is a place of some honor." Kermorven shook his head. "I have a better for you. Hold yourselves ready to my command, and keep down your banners till then." Abruptly, the air was shuddering about them with the same rattling thunder and roar as before, but nearer, much nearer. The Ekwesh tensed, spun about, and sniffed at the wind like a hunting hound, this way and that. Then he lifted his spear and pointed at the rounded crest of the high hill before them. All eyes followed him, but upon its unstained whiteness there seemed to be nothing to see. Suddenly it was as if the sharp skyline of the hill grew blurred. Another breath, and it had grown a fine fringe that swelled and wavered and rose higher. All along the rim of the hills that spear swung, and as it passed, as if somehow calling it up, the line arose, shimmering like wind-blown grass. In the utter silence, Elof heard Rock, standing beside him, swallowing convulsively, and realized then how dry his own throat had become. The line stretched out in a great half-moon around them, from the hills inland to where the land fell away down steep slopes into the valley. At the end, small specks were still bounding to complete the line, and rank upon rank behind it. For this was the shield wall of the armies of the Ekwesh, and every seeming grass blade was one of their long oval shields, man-high. The army below, that a moment before had seemed so vast in its numbers, dwindled and shrank in Elof's eyes before that shimmering mass. He saw men's faces grow pale all around him, their knuckles whiten upon rein and weapon. Kermorven, apparently impassive, was quietly and unnecessarily loosing his gray-gold sword in its scabbard. "Look at them," breathed one of his captains, appalled. "Look at the numbers of them. There must be 50,000 if there's a man." "And more in yon tower," growled Ills, "but we'll deal with them later. For now, it's only slay 2 to 1, and in the old days, it was a poor Durg couldn't manage that now and again." Still in the eerie silence, save for the crunch of feet among the snow-clad stones, a long section of the northernmost line detached themselves and padded downward, hunched down and slipping swiftly between hillocks and along gullies, till they were just beyond bowshot of Kermorven's lines. They stopped there as if waiting, for one long, breathless moment, and then, at an order howled from the hill, they swung up their short spears in a glittering mass, whirled about, away from both armies, and towards the tower of the gates itself. It seemed to Elof, straining his eyes, that he saw high on the balcony below the round tower a soft gleam of gold that shifted, as it might be fair hair, but dark hair he was too distant to make out. Then the Ekwesh cried out a single word, unmistakably a salute, and lifting their shields of stiffened hide over wood, they sang out a hooting, carrying call, and rattled the blades of their spears flat against them. "Autu oe!" Across the ridges, the whole vast army echoed them, and the drumming of the shields swelled and rang off the cold rock walls of the valley, a savage, terrifying music of war. "That's what that row was," barked Ills. Her large eyes creased into deep wrinkles as she squinted across the snow. "Not quite," said Elof. "There was more." Below the rise, the old raven chieftain, growing impatient, seized his shield and slammed it hard, and all of his men would have echoed him had not Kermorven barked for quiet. They subsided at once, but looked sullen and resentful. Even as he spoke, the foremost of the enemy whirled back suddenly. Among them a chant begun, a sung line and a massed response, almost like a sea shanty. "Away ya, hug! Away ya ya, hug! Out to ho ya!" On that last word, all joined in, brandished their spears, and rattled them against their shields once more. "You speak their tongue better than I, Elof," Kermorven muttered. "Can you catch any of that?" "Only the salute. The last word. Autu. It means slay." They were leaping in time to it, dancing even, a strange bounding step, on the spot at first, then carrying them forward a step, 1, 2. With frightening suddenness and a great howling shout of "Autu!" the dance became a charging run, and the first wave of Ekwesh swept forward towards the lines of Karis and Morvenhall. A shoal of arrows hissed out to meet them, and many fell beneath the feet of their fellows. Another shout from the hill, and the rush halted, but did not retreat, remaining there, the copper-skinned men dancing and chanting in mockery, while the deadly shafts sang into their uneven lines and sent one after another sprawling in agony on the frozen soil. Impaled and contorted, grotesquely propped up by the embedded shafts. It was an evil spectacle, So much bravery, so ill used, and for one long moment it held all eyes in horror. All eyes save those of the ravens, who had looked upon worse and laughed. It was their shout that brought Kermorven whirling around. "A decoy, by the powers!" yelled the king. Like a gray tide creeping, the southernmost quarter of the shield wall had detached itself and advanced, was even now padding stealthily down the lower slopes and onto the plain. "Sound horns! Stand to your posts!" As they saw their ruse discovered, the black-clad chieftains upon the hill stretched out their spears and called in baying voices. The advancing troops abandoned their stealthy, crouching gait, and with a great shout and rattling of spear upon shield, they sprang up and broke into a fast trot that rapidly became a headlong downhill plunge. The crisp snow flew up beneath their feet and hid them, so that the shield seemed to glide forward across an icy cloud, and the crunch of each man's footfall, magnified many 1,000-fold, became at last the mounting, unearthly roar that they had heard across the hills. Kermorven measured the distance with a keen eye, then waved his hand. A horn sounded, and from within the ranks the catapults he had taken from the ships sang and slammed. It was a well-timed stroke. Rocks and darts went whistling down upon the advancing lines. Black-armored warriors were transfixed, dashed down like skittles, or crushed outright. But they left hardly a gap in that immense line, nor slowed the onrush. Some rocks overshot, but came tumbling back down the slope to take the Eqwesh from behind. Here and there the snow cover broke and slid away in little avalanches, sweeping warriors away helpless as insects struggling in sand. The catapults were frantically reloaded, and some even had time to fire. But the main lines were already under the arc of their flight, and was only the few stragglers they caught. Now arrows began to sing down from the hilltops. A long shot, but in the tight-packed formation Kermorven had ordered, they seldom wanted a mark. Men fell groaning and screaming, but their cries sounded thin and ridiculous against the rising thunder of oncoming feet. For the first time, Elof actually felt a thing he had only read of: the earth shuddering beneath him at an enemy's tread. Amid their snow cloud, the Eqwesh came on like the stormy surf of a vast ocean. And like surf, that first massive onrush struck Kermorven's shield wall and burst over it with a roar. Or, so it seemed. An endless moment of flurry and confusion, roaring and screaming and the rattle of arms took hold. Tide shield boomed against metal, pike and sword clinked against the Eqwesh spears, short-shafted, broad-bladed, that could be wielded as either, while from the second rank long spears stabbed out over the shoulders of the defenders. Elof itched to take wing, to see and fight from above, but in this barren land they had little fuel to burn, and he must save it for great need. It was too much to take in, too complex and terrible a sight, this mutual slaughter of many thousands of men. Even to Elof's sharp eyes, only fragmentary images registered among the confusion. Small scenes that seemed to be repeated, played out over and over again wherever one looked along that long line of battle, like recurring patterns of some potent work of smithcraft. some immense and frenzied frieze, patterns brief, bloody, all too vivid. Here a pike sheared away a hide shield and the arm that held it, raking open the black-armored ribs behind. There, a sword wedged in the wooden frame of another such shield, gray and serpent-crested, then fell from its wielder's hand as, like the serpent's tongue, the deadly spear flicked out. Here, a tall warrior sprang up on bodies sprawled across the breastworks, only to rise straight up into the air, thrashing like a fish upon the spear that impaled him. There, a man of Morvenhall was knocked back across the breastworks by a hide shield, and had time to scream in terror at the spear that plunged toward his heart. But a metal shield felled his slayer to his knees in the snow as a man of the second rank stepped into his place, and a long spear drove under the Eqwesh armor. He fell thrashing, dragging the spear with him, and his assailant drew blade to confront the man behind. Over and over again, such scenes took place, made all the more uniform when distance or the clouds of powder snow, pink-tinged now, hid the adversaries' faces. To Elof then it took on a dreamlike quality, as if two armies of ghosts were condemned to eternal battle, where each man who fell rose at once to fight again. Then, quite suddenly, like glass that cools or ice that melts, the scene cleared. The confusion resolved to reveal most of the Eqwesh milling and thrashing against the ring of shields, still sparring viciously with its defenders, but to little effect. Kermorven's tight formation had played the strong seawall to the human surf. Most it had held, and what had passed it had scattered like flecks of foam. Alone, intruders burst like foam indeed against the second rank, thrust through even as they yelled their triumph. And for larger groups also, Kermorven had made ready. His few squadrons of horses and picked bands of pikemen ranged freely between the ranks, blocking any breach and falling upon any who passed through. No intruders lived more than seconds. Only at the apex of the charge was the shield wall truly breached, brave men borne down with broad spears biting at their vitals. And there at once the horns sounded, and men of the second lines moved up around the gap, enclosing the influx of Eqwesh in a shallow arrowhead hedged with spears and thorned with spear and pike. Those of the fore, isolated in the narrow channel and beset from three sides, were driven onto their points by the sheer weight of the press from behind, and their bodies piled up to serve their slayers as a grisly breastworks of their own. The chieftains on the hill, seeing how ill even this breach was faring, bade new commands. All along the line, the black-armored warriors broke off their skirmishing and dropped back. But those caught within the arrowhead could not move so quickly, to their undoing. With a hungry roar, the two ends of the reinforced line rolled over the uncertain press in their path, stabbing and slashing, trampling what fell, narrowing and closing the arrowhead till the line stood whole once more. The ranks of the Eqwesh drew back, many still dancing and chanting mockingly as they trotted back up the slopes once more. But they left the ground before the shield wall a stinking, trampled slush, brown with blood, strewn with bodies like rain-felled grass. A wild cheer went up from within the Karis lines, and some, foolish or blood-drunk, broke ranks to follow. Their captains roared them back, and they came all the faster when a couple of the foremost dropped with Eqwesh darts in their bellies. The archers on the hills began to fire further and faster, Now there was less danger of hitting their own ranks.
"Well, we've held them,"
said Rock tensely, and without any note of rejoicing.
"but that was just their first wave. What next, Kermorven? More of the same?"
I think not, said Kermorven. They have failed to whelm our lines. Now they will strive to break them. The chiefest question is, where, on which flank will they strike? Why not on all? Growled Ilse. There's enough of 'em, by Ilmarinen. No. In such a melee, they could not keep control of their forces, and that would serve us better than anything. He danced hurriedly aside as a heavy catapult arrow came hissing down and skipped across the stone near his feet. Nor could they fire down into it so freely, lest they hit their own. They will sooner try the lance. I think now the club has failed, and they will tip that lance with hardened warriors. But where? Where? I think I know, said Elof quietly. Look there. High on the hillside, there was activity behind the motionless front wall. Gray shields were streaming over the hill brow and down into the center of the shield wall, to the west of them. It may be, began Kermorven. Then he broke off. Even as the last few gray shields bounced into the line, a wailing call rang out from the hill. The outer shield wall parted and melted back, and the grays took their place. Their shields bore the same serpent pattern as the banners that lifted and fluttered overhead. There were no chants now, no dance. One more wail from above, one jabbing spear lifted in answer, and with a single shout of "Hoy!" the gray shields swept down the hill. As they ran, their line bent back from the middle into a wedge shape, and all the rest of that vast phalanx on the central slope, some 9,000 or 10,000 men, fell in behind it. Well nigh as many warriors as Morvenhall's whole army raced in a giant spearhead towards the western edge of Kermorven's lines, with the gray serpents tossing at its point. If we'd had but a few hours more for earthworks, hissed Ilse between her large teeth as she watched that inexorable rush. Then she winced in sympathy as the two lines collided with a terrible, juddering crash of shield on shield. So might two mountains sound that made war upon the plains, hurling down their slopes of stone. Elof held his breath, for it seemed no mere wall of human thews could sustain that impact. Even as he thought that, he heard the horns bray alarm around him, saw the outer line seem to shudder and dissolve, falling back, aside, inwards, any way, as the great column of Eqwesh came charging through, and the writhing banners came driving with breathless speed straight towards the heart of the ring, the King's Rock. He cursed and snatched at his sword, but even as Gorthar sang out of its scabbard, he realized that the fragmented lines had not dissolved, only shifted again. For a moment, they had curled in on themselves, spirals of shuffling men. Then suddenly, they were sharp-edged squares, islands shored with shields and forested with blades, solid and impregnable, against the churning Ekwesh, their charge thrown into confusion by the sudden dissipation of its target. The smaller surface the squares presented meant that only a few at a time could come against each face, and they met the same double or triple ranks as before, and an impenetrable press of men behind. The rest, angry and impatient, could only mill around and shout. The veterans of the Serpent clan alone kept their heads, it seemed, for they held together and drove hard against the inner rings that had not been pierced, but had drawn closer about the King's Rock. Many fell, but the press began to tell, and Elof saw that they would burst through any moment. Kermorven paid them no apparent heed, but strode over to the edge and called down,
"Ravens all! Now is your hour! Pluck me down that serpent!"
He gestured. Horns sounded. The hard-pressed lines gave back, and with a hoarse yell of triumph, the serpents came streaming through. But the old chieftain had sprung up with a cry of his own, and hammered spear shaft against shield. His followers echoed him, and took up the cry,
"Cookchu, Hawatl! The raven is upon you!"
With no more ado, they fell upon their fellow tribe. Around the rock, chaos flowed, and from the throng, of a sudden, the serpent banner burst. Around it a tight knot of hard-faced men. The slope they charged, and throwing aside the cares of the greater battle, the captains drew blade and turned to fight for themselves. Rock cast down his bow, and unhooked his mace from his belt. Ills plucked up her axe. Kermorven, drawing on his helm and fastening down the fearsome jeweled eye mask that was its visor, turned to Elof. "Stay here. You cannot walk on this rough stone, and there is no time for your wings. None shall reach you while we are on our feet." Then, sweeping the gray gold blade from its scabbard, he bounded down the steep crag with Rock and Ills on his heels, and hurled himself into the onrush. To left and right of him he hewed with all the fierce art of his youth, harnessing the impact of each savage blow to launch himself into the next. He became the center of a grotesque death dance, black-armored figures springing in, then rebounding back, flung bodily from his path, or capering a moment and collapsing like clumsy dolls. From the moment of his coming, the onrush was stemmed. Elof, perched on his crutches, cursed his infirmity, and all who had caused it, for though he was not naturally a warlike man, it galled him to be left helpless, watching his friends at risk. Gorthar seemed to shiver and sing in his grasp, and he began to hobble and clamber painfully down towards the fighting, striving to see more clearly. Neither Rock nor Ills could he make out, their short figures lost in the crush. But Kermorven, taller even than the Ekwesh, stood out clearly. He seemed at no peril. Indeed, the fight was swirling away from him as the Ekwesh saw him hew down their strongest by twos and threes. Elof saw him bend down then over somebody fallen, and hurried to look closer. It was Ills, with blood streaming from her leg. But then two tall Ekwesh made a sudden rush. Ills cried out, Kermorven whirled, but a shield clubbed him on the side of the neck and sent him staggering back. One Ekwesh raised his spear to stab. Elof, still beyond sword's reach, leaned on one crutch and lashed out with the other. The stabbing arm was stopped in midair. Then Gorthar thrust deep into the bared armpit, and the man fell with a retching gasp. The other rounded on Elof, but the crutch struck him in the face, and the black sword took him below his breastplate, up behind the ribs. Another ran up, shield raised. Elof slammed the crutch against it, knocking him sprawling, and thrust him through the back with Gorthar, then wrenched it free, slashed another across the breast, and with a growl of effort, toppled him from the rock. Now the attackers were themselves attacked. Beneath the banner, a huge man, head crowned with bobbing white plumes, face and arms ringed with the swirling bluish citruses of high rank, roared out an order, gathered such of his men as he still could about him. As swiftly as they had come, they gave back, turned, and vanished into the fray. Elof turned to his friends. Ilse, forgetting her own injury, had removed Kermorvan's helm, and he was already staggering up, grimacing with disgust as he fingered his bruised neck.
"Let no man call you cripple evermore, Master Smith," he gasped. "A foot or a wing. My friend, you are the great manslayer I once named you."
Elof grimaced. "Master Smith, I prefer. Are you all right?" Kermorvan's clear laugh rang with triumph.
"I am, by your good grace. And all the better for seeing how the field stands now."
Elof knew that the old raven had spoken truly, until first the master smith, and then Louhi, had managed to tame their rivalries. The great tribes of the Eqwesh had made constant war over the scanty resources of their barren homeland. Anywhere else, the serpents might have been wary of their kin, but here they had fought their way, as they thought, into the very heart of their enemies, only to find there a strong force of their own kind. For a moment, evidently, they had assumed that these were their fellows coming to their aid, and that moment was fatal. The raven's attack struck them as a stunning shock. An awesome stroke of magecraft that thus stood the battle on its head, and the ravens, with the weapons of Karis many had adopted, were terrifying opponents. The serpent's charge stopped dead. They lifted their shields in a feeble attempt to defend themselves, but panic blazed through their ranks, and those behind turned at once to flee. Out into the milling mass around the squares they charged, and in that disordered hubbub their fright was contagious. Heads turned, warriors already balked and frustrated by the disorder saw them flee and began to draw back themselves. The press eased, and the squares, still holding doggedly together, began little by little to move. Two came together and joined, and bore down upon another that was hardest pressed. There, too, the Eqwesh gave back at sight of this creeping dragon thing of shields that slowly but surely trampled over any in its path. They began to stream away. In moments, the chieftains were again yelling from the hilltops, and the men of the great onrush turned and went pounding away. But there was no dancing nor mockery now, for of that great wedge of men, over half lay dead among slime and mud, the heat of their spilled blood thawing even this frosty ground. And behind that mighty heap of corpses, Kermorvan's sundered lines were already forming anew. Elof heaved a deep sigh of relief, but Kermorvan's countenance was grim. "Why so, my long lad?" demanded Ilse, leaning on his arm. "Your plan worked well. Our losses are light compared to theirs."
"Losses they remain. There is worse to come. Nevertheless, I am thankful. But what's this?"
Through the press shouldered the leader of the ravens, bearing something towards the rock. Before Kermorvan's feet they unrolled it, with a bellow of laughter, the chiefest banner of the serpents, and within it, impaled upon the staff, a naked corpse, obscenely mutilated, but with those chains of citrices still recognizable. Ills whistled and chuckled softly in Elof's ear. As well we didn't recruit the real savages, I guess. But Kermorvan remained imperturbable. Stepping down from the rock, he gave the grisly trophy grave attention, commended the talons of the ravens who had seized the serpent, then ordered the chieftain wrapped in his banner again, and laid honorably aside with the others slain. This surprised the ravens, accustomed to displaying the bodies of their more notable foes, but appeared to impress them deeply, the more so when Kermorvan ordered their banners to be flown above the hill with all the rest. "They have earned it," he said, returning to his vantage, "and it will confirm the tale of those who fled. That may be of some use to us. To cover their shame, they will magnify the numbers they met. Among the common warriors, rumors will spread that Ekwesh can be our friend and fight beside us. It may even unnerve the true fanatics a little." "Are you so sure?" demanded Elof. "It may weaken the hold on their minds a little, but enough? And how soon?" "Not enough to win us this battle, of course. But if we win it, ah yes, then it may make a great difference. If. But that remains to be seen. No, my old friend, there is only one thing I am sure of, and that is that there is hard hewing ahead before the night comes." In this, Kermorvan proved himself a true prophet. There are many accounts in the chronicles of that last and greatest of battles in the defense of Caris, and they differ over many points, for so vast a conflict can seldom look alike to any one pair of eyes, and to each man his own standpoint must often have seemed the most hard-pressed and perilous. Yet all agree that between midday and evening 4 more such great onslaughts were unleashed against the combined ranks of Caris and Morvenhall, and smaller assaults unnumbered, and that many broke through even to the King's Rock. But though they differ as to how, they agree that the ranks, though sadly diminished and frequently broken, never panicked, nor sought to run, and that all these assaults were turned, though at great cost, all save the very last. For there came a point towards evening when Kermorvan, squinting out across his regrouping lines, turned a weary head to his friends and said quite calmly, "They have done bravely, very bravely, but I do not believe they can withstand the next assault." A grim silence fell. Elof, looking out at the sinking sun glaring from a gray sky, realized that he had long ago accepted that this would be so. It had scarcely seemed to matter. Ilse, refastening the bandage around her slashed leg, lifted an eyebrow, but said nothing. Evidently, she felt much the same. Kermorvan looked from one to another of his captains, then at the gray gold blade he held. The blood of many men intermingled upon it. A catapult arrow whined overhead, and he nodded, as if coming to some further conclusion. Then he turned to Elof. There is one stroke we might essay still, but those archers on the southward hills with their long view may ruin it. I've not asked this of you before, because it was too perilous to justify. But they must be dealt with, or at the very least distracted, even as the onslaught comes. At all events, their attention must be held, only for a few minutes. That you can do, and no other. Elof grinned, felt his mouth tense and turn wolfish. He hefted Gorthar and raised himself on the one crutch left him. "Build me a good fire, then," was all he said. Out on the slopes, the ranks of shields were moving again, and another chant beginning, along the lines of the first, but louder, more mocking. They too scented victory, fearfully depleted as their numbers were. "Deo toai haio," sang a single voice, and deep voices a guttural response. "Io te chiogo." Then the line was repeated, but to a different response, a singing bass line. "Kawe o ho! Kawe ho!" to which spears were brandished, sawing the air. Then they were struck against shields, no longer merely rattled, but hammered butt first. 3 savage blows that made the hide boom like a metallic drum. The ring and crash of it burst like thunderclaps among the hills and echoed shivering from the cliffs. Snow dropped from the ledges. Rocks split and tumbled away with a roar. Though his head reeled with the noise, Elof caught the meaning of the song all too clearly. "Sheep of the valley, come to the slaughter. Sheep of the valley, come and be slain. Come die. Calves of the bison, stand for the arrow. Calves of the bison, come to the blood trough. Come bleed." All eyes were on him, and he felt appallingly alone. He realized suddenly that he had no idea what Kermorven intended. His hands full with the ravens, he had taken little part in the actual planning of the battle. But then the fire blazed and crackled, and he had no time left to ask. He swept down his wings, held them a moment as fierce heat beat on his numbed cheeks, then swept them back with a rush that caused the dangled banners overhead to thrash and stiffen. The heat vanished with painful suddenness. He dared not linger, but raised an arm in salute to Kermorven and his friends, and letting fall his crutches, he swept up into the icy airs. A great shout went up from the ranks below as he rose, as if he was some living banner, and he knew the fleet men must be remembering how once before he had plucked victory from defeat for them, and hoping. They were a burden, these hopes. They weighed down his spirit, so that he found no release in his flight, only grim necessity. A wailing command drifted up to him, and a deep shout in answer. He looked down across the hills, and saw the great lines of shields, sweeping forward like the incoming tide. The orange sun glinted dully off his plumage. He was high enough. He would have to be. He hovered a moment, wings thrashing, gauging his time, and drew Gorthar from his belt. Then, as the Equest shield walls reached the plain and broke into their last run, he tilted in the air and dropped, the black blade outthrust before him, falling as fast, he felt, as the lightning that had forged it. He did not, could not, see that moment when, among a shivering crash of shields, the 2 great armies collided for the last time. But in his very bones, he felt it. There were the archers, a rough line of catapults, and a few hundred men scattered widely across the hilltop, taking advantage of whatever small eminence they could find. He saw one perched in the blackened carcass of a tree, and swooped towards him. The man had time to see, twirl around, loose one wild shot, and shriek, for so Elof had intended. All eyes turned to him as the black blade struck, and the fountaining body fell headlong through the branches. Then the air was alive with shafts. They fell far behind him, some among the catapults. Another archer, perched on a rock, fell right in his path and was cut down. Two more dived for cover. A third was left swift and paid the penalty. Elof whirled around, wings thrashing, and headed for the catapults. Only the lightest had a chance to fire before he was among them, hewing out at their cords and the arms that drew them. Windlasses spun and sang. Men shrieked and fell, many under the panicky shafts of their fellows as he passed. Compared to the slaughter on the plains below, it was nothing, but it ensured what Kermorven desired, that every eye on that southern ridge should be fastened on him as he glided up and away. His, though, turned towards the plain, seeking some assurance that his flight had worked. Found only dismay. The ranks of Caris and Morvenhall, so sorely tried, had broken even as Kermorven predicted. No longer was there any calculated regrouping, no squares, no order at all. It seemed that no man had any sense of it left in him, had any thought left at all save to flee and save his own skin as best he could. Elof was appalled to see the King's Rock empty, abandoned, and the many banners bobbing this way and that near the head of the throng leaned desperately over the valley's edge and down onto the steep slopes beyond. He must have fled almost at once, before the collision even. The Eqwesh, abandoning their own shield wall in triumphant contempt, were streaming this way and that after the stragglers. Where was Kermorven then? He would never have allowed this if he was still in command. With leaden heart, Elof soared up, fighting an urge to fall like a thunderbolt upon the Eqwesh chieftains. That would help nobody, neither his friends nor Kara. But what could, now? Then, from his greater height, he saw over the valley's rim, and laughed aloud in glory and amazement. A wilder gambol he had never witnessed, nor a more marvelous feat of order. Perhaps the Eqwesh thought so also, as in their bloodthirsty pursuit they poured over the rim of the slopes, ready to butcher all they overtook. For what they found there was no terrified trail of fugitives, but the same fearsome shield walls they had faced all that day long, regrouped now in 3 solid ranks all along that slope, with more forming behind as the seeming fugitives poured in. The rear ranks must have pulled back first, pretending to flee while the outer ranks held, and used the time to order their array. The archers could have seen that happening, and passed a warning to the main force. But because Kermorven had unleashed Elof upon them, they had not, and the greater part of that last onslaught poured over the slope at speed like maddened beasts stampeded into a spike-lined pit. And like beasts, they perished. Many, unable to stop themselves, plunged headlong onto the spear points, Others sought to turn, but slipped and fell on the trodden snow. Some managed to turn, only to be knocked back down by their own eager fellows rushing along behind, or struck down by the stragglers they had thought to harry. In the blink of an eye, the slope had turned to a scarlet fall of blood. So many died in those first chaotic seconds. Chaotic for the Eqwesh, for among the ranks of their foes there reigned an implacable calm, as if Kermorvan's cool mind lay like a mantle across them. The onrush of the Eqwesh slackened, as from the cities below some realization dawned that all was not as they thought it. But even as they stumbled gradually to a halt, horns sounded, and with a single hoarse shout, the shield wall rose and paced forward, up to the edge of the slope and over. Even to Elof it seemed a fearsome sight, those solid walls of shields, rank after rank, arising suddenly over the valley's rim, blood-reddened, flashing with red fire as they caught the last long rays of the sunset. To the Eqwesh, seized by sudden uncertainty after the intoxication of victory, it must have seemed appalling. Many must have thought it a whole new army, come in the nick of time to the relief of the one they had broken. But even to those who did not, it must have seemed no less marvelous that ranks once scattered should cohere once more. Grim fighters as the Eqwesh were, they had never been held together by the same strong bonds of discipline as the men of Morvenhall, or followed a leader out of regard and love rather than fear. Thus all the awe and terror that Louhi and her shadowy kindred of the ice relied upon in dealing with their thralls turned at that crucial point against her. For all their subservience to their chieftains, for all the hold the shamans of the hidden clan had on the hearts of the Eqwesh, they had always been prone to panic. For those who were dominated through fear are in the end ruled by it, and their hearts may fail them sooner than those whose obedience is freely given and truly earned. So it had been before with the Eqwesh. When the master-smiths fell, so it had proved in the Eastlands, when Kara's influence was taken from them. And here, for all the fire that she, Morgannon, warrior of the powers, chooser of the slain, could pour into their hearts, it was so again. They saw what they could not understand. Menace arising where none should have been. Being accustomed to fear such things, they could not confront it. They looked back to their chieftain, only to see, high in the airs above them, the vision of an armed man aloft on immense wings. The greater part of them took fright, and turned on their heels to run. Many did not, but they were out of their shield wall now, each man for himself against an army of men they had molded in their own likeness, as fell and grim as any, and better armed. They stood and perished, and the rest, seeing this, fled all the faster. In vain the chieftains cried out from the hilltops. In vain they came down onto the plain and harangued the fugitives, sought to seize them, and in the end menaced them with weapons. Their own men cut them down. Into the passes of the hills a broken rabble streamed, leaderless, heedless. Above them the sun set, and to their minds the sudden darkness and bitter cold seemed only another device of their foes. They sank down and sought shelter, or ran on mindless till they fell. without thought of food or fire or the means to make either, and the frost settled upon them like the wrath of the ice they had betrayed, and tightened its grip. They were hardy men, but they had fought a long day, and that last run sapped their endurance. Of those who ran from the battle, more than 2/3 parts are thought to have perished that night among the hills, and it is said that some fell, not to the cold, but to the many kinds of night walkers and trolls the ice had sent to haunt those lands, who cared not whose blood they took. To the high gate and the wrath of Loki, only a fragment returned of the vast force that had been sent out. Yet in her pride, and the nearness of her victory, she gave no thought to flight, but made ready for the siege she guessed must follow. On the field they had fled, few thought ahead to that. There was no rejoicing, for so utterly drained and exhausted were they in body and mind that they could scarce take in the fact of victory, let alone its scale and consequence. When the horns sounded their release, the weary soldiers of the shield walls could only sink down among the bloody mud, grateful for even a brief respite, a moment of life where neither man nor weapon menaced them. Gradually, as they grew used to the vast wind-scoured silence that had replaced frenzied tumult, they began to realize what they had done. But the awful cost of it was clear to all. Of the armies of Caris and Morvenhold together, that had numbered some 30,000 men, there remained only 17,000 alive, and well nigh 2,000 of those grievously enough wounded to be unable to fight. How many Equish had fallen was never tallied, but it is generally agreed that out of a full force of some 50,000, not 12,000 had joined that mad flight into the darkness, and 4,000 at most survived it. All around them, then, as far as the distant foothills, as near as the trampled paste at their feet, the stench in their nostrils utterly inescapable. That darkling plain was carpeted with the broken limbs and the spilled blood of at least 50,000 men. No other description of the scene than that is given in any chronicle, and none is needed. There could be scant celebration in the midst of that horrendous carnage. The salute with which the armies greeted Elof as he came gliding clumsily in on the back of night rose hoarse and grim from their throats. But a salute it was. Exhausted, the force of his wings long spent, he missed his precarious footing and landed hard in that noisome mud. But he lost no time in reporting to the king all that he had seen. Kermorven nodded, as if he had conjured up the rout already in his mind's eye. I hoped as much. Victory is ours, yet it only flutters before us, to be blown hence if we do not stretch out a hand to seize it, however weary. We must march out at once to lay siege to the high gate itself. Must we indeed? Interrupted one of the nobles of Caris. My lord, you have worked great wonders, but at a great cost. Do not wastefully make it greater. Elof bit his lip. It had swiftly become clear that the vast majority of their fallen, as many as 11,000, were Carismen. This might easily have been because they were so much wearier and worse fed for months before, less well fed and skilled in war, but malicious tongues would not be found lacking to suggest that Kermorven had spilled those lives to shield his own folk. His horsemen in particular, he had been most sparing with. "Aye, my lord," put in another noble. "Your will swayed the battle well enough, but can it whip up limbs whose strength is spent? Hasten hearts at the brink of cracking? For yon's folk I cannot speak, but the men of Kerris are fordone. They must rest or perish."
If they try resting on this freezing butcher's slab, they'll perish anyway, growled Rock. Of cold in the night or pestilence tomorrow. Better die on the march than that.
But Kermorven raised a commanding hand. "You are both of you right, my friends. But no dispute need arise, because our forces must be divided in any case. The High Gate has two approaches, and we must lay siege to them both. What I command, therefore, is this. Hot on the heels of the Ekwesh shall go the forces of Morvenhall, and any others who wish it. But the men of Kerris, who have suffered more in the march here, may descend into the valley, and there find shelter and fuel for fires among the trees. But having rested for a few hours, they will cross the frozen river, climb the northern slopes, and lay siege to the gate from that flank, blocking all approaches, and watchful for new forces coming from the north. You will travel swifter than we then, because you know the land, and will not have to deal with stragglers. But all this must be accomplished by dawn, and no later. That is your charge, my lords." So it was that 3 long columns filed away from that terrible field, and left it empty beneath the gathering darkness. 3, for not even the wounded could be suffered to linger, lest the carnage breed disease. Kermorven was sending them, with such comforts as could be spared, southward towards the landings. But his own forces he led with little or no respite up into the hills, walking like the rest of his footmen to spare the strength of his horses for when it might be needed. In this, and in much else, he was proven wise, for many times that night, as the column wound like a long snake through a mass of little hills and vales, it was set upon by bands of Ekwesh diehards, willing to make desperate and damaging strikes in search of food, or simply revenge. Cavalry proved the most effective answer to such depredations, charging swiftly and frighteningly up and down the long lines. It was for such a chance, in victory or retreat, that Kermorven had reserved them. But there were other enemies abroad against whom cavalry was of little use. The breeze was freshening as they neared the sea, but the clouds remained obstinately solid. They marched without light of moon or star, and as few torches as they dared. In the shifting of darkness, shapes seemed to move, shadows to skulk at the edge of vision. They were not all illusions. Among the deepest shadows of the dales, dark things snarled and slunk away from Ekwesh corpses, or flitted up like giant bats. Men who straggled or strayed from the main column, even a short way, all too often vanished without a trace. In one deep dell, overgrown with thorns, 3 men vanished. When Rock took a party of ravens to search for them, They found only bloodstains and strange footprints, and at the sight of those, the ravens all but dragged him away. The mounted scouts seemed to rove safely enough until Elof, serving as one since he had perforce to ride, found two of them dismembered in the shadow of a giant boulder. Even as he summoned help, he himself was snared by the huge arms that reached over the top, and almost met the same fate before lancers and mounted bowmen arrived to slay the brutes. Kermorven, inspecting the scene as the column plodded past, grimaced at the rivulets of dark blood upon the rock, the tangles of grayish fur hanging over its edge, and the yellow tusks grinning moistly between taunted lips. "Our old friends, the snow trolls," he remarked, his face drawn and pale as he watched the columns come plodding up the slope. "3 of them, come back to finish what their cousins of our land failed in long ago. I almost thought they had succeeded." Cold shivered on Elof's neck. "Thanks to your foresight, they did not. Thanks to my horsemen, they heard you before we did. Those brutes, they were not even killing out of hunger. The remains of some 20 men lie behind that rock, set neatly to keep in the snow." He shuddered. "I could curse this land, but it is accursed already. What will cleanse it? What will sweep away this dreadful night?" "The wind, maybe?" remarked Ilse, limping up to them. "Feel it. It blows stronger, and we have marched a good 5 hours now. We must be nearing the sea." The chill breath touched Elof's neck again, and he realized it was real. It blew away the reek of slaughter and touched his lips with the keen tang of drift. Together they hurried up to the hilltop, and even as they climbed they saw that the heavy clouds had begun to shift. Solid, no longer, but stirring, rending, tearing. Here and there pale gleams shone through the gaps, and the snow-clad hills around them stood out silver clear against the deep blue skies. "The banners of the ice break and grow ragged," said Elof. "Let it be a signal to her." But even as he spoke, they reached the summit, and Ilse cried out and pointed. They had reached the sea indeed. At the base of that long slope it lay, its surf all but deadened by the ice that choked its shores. But they hardly spared it a second glance, for there, only a little way to the north of them, the high gate also had awoken to life, shining and shimmering like some monstrous jewel beneath the sinking moon. From the battle plains they had seen the gleam of ice enshrouding it, but now they stared in wonder and horror, and many rubbed their eyes, as if some glamour of magecraft were laid upon their sight. Even in the few short hours since last they saw it, it had changed and grown, its battlements glittering beneath crowns of dazzling snow, its galleries hung about with icicles of incalculable size and beauty, its stern walls lost beneath rippling depths of translucent blue and green, rich as sapphire, deep as the sunlit sea. They seemed a greater architecture in themselves, a palace of ice that encased, enveloped the ancient stronghold of stone almost mockingly, a shell of vast columns that dwarfed the original structure, immense blue-lit pillars that tapered down even into the frozen cascade of the waterfall below. Its stern lines softened into curves as sweeping as an ice-bound wave. Its straight, unworn walls swirled and ornamented with fantastic shapes. The high gate in all its grandeur was reduced only to the barren core upon which something vastly more majestic was founded. It was a towering vision of the might and nobility of the ancient powers, a creation of unhuman beauty and strength so great that it awoke a yearning ache in the hearts of all who gazed upon it, as if they were children looking from their own scrawled slates to the supreme jewel of some great master's mind and hand, and seeing the vast gulf that separated them, their own joys shriveling the petty things they had been so proud of. It was beauty that struck men like a blow and cowed them. And just as it mocked their ideals, so equally it seemed to laugh at their warlike ambitions. For what could any assault launched by men mean to such walls as those? How could they be assailed, being ice deeply overlaid upon stone, doubling the strengths of both? Who could scale that wall of slippery glass, or hurl stone or dart against it? The largest throwing weapons of men would be as helpless against it as slingshots in the hands of their children. In every sense, it seemed to tower above them, this awesome thing, as indifferent to their hatred as it would be to their worship. They might do either, and it would scarcely matter. A great silence fell over that whole army. Men fell upon their knees, or shrank down behind their shields, or simply stood and stared at that eerie fortress of the cold as the moon sank slowly down behind it, crowning it with lights and leaving them once more in darkness. By its mere existence, it cast down their hearts and held their minds in thrall. Elof felt no such urge to bow down, though he shared in their awe. The undertow of horror and revulsion it awoke in his mind was too great for that. In the fate of that noble fortress, encased within that sternly glittering shell, he seemed to see a vision of the impending fate of the whole rich and varied world that he loved, and of Kara most of all. And it came to him now that it might be too late to prevent it. Was the chilly triumph of that vision, the sudden burgeoning of it, an earnest that the crucial point had already passed? The balance already tilted? Had the cold hands of the ice closed at last upon the world? So he was held, as was each of them in their own way. In the end, it was Ilse's voice, loud and sardonic, that broke the silence upon the hill. "A pretty toy, if it's to your mind. But don't mistake it for more solid craft. What's this beside the high mountains, huh? That Ilmarinen forged from the very earth fires, and gave to us as a refuge and a home, when last these chilly powers sought to plaster the world thus in their tuppenny trumpery." She gave a snort of scornful laughter, echoed by Guri and the other Duergar, and thumped Elof and Kermorvan hard upon the back. "Look with the eyes of the elder folk, you fools of men, and don't be deceived by mere melting charms." Kermorvan shook himself. massaging his neck and blinking like a man awakening from a long and haunted sleep.
I wondered why the clouds broke so conveniently,
he muttered.
when she might have held them. She was readying her defenses. She meant us to see the place clearly.
And now it'll work against her, whooped Ills triumphantly. Look alive, man. Don't just stand there blinking. It'll be dawn soon. A clear dawn. And what have we labored so long on our weapon for, if not this? Kermorven gazed down at her a moment, then flinging aside his customary dignity, he caught her up and kissed her with startling vehemence. Then, setting her down gently, he seized a horn from one of his captains and blew a piercing blast. It coursed like a shock of lightning through those still ranks. Men jumped and shuddered where they stood, shaking off the subtle thrall the vision had laid upon them.
"Morven Hall!"
he shouted, the ancient and bitter battle cry of his line.
Morven shall rise! Up, all of you, and into your ranks once more! Stand firm upon the living earth. Feel your blood flow and heed no sendings of the barren ice. Form up and await the dawn.
His clear voice rang against those glittering battlements, challenging and defiant, and it seemed to awaken a response in the world around them, from the depths to the heights of the very skies. For even as the army took up his battle cry and sent it roaring like a tide against the castellans of the ice, so in the east behind them came the first faint gleam of light. Gray at first, but turning swiftly to the palest gold. And as the men came streaming past, summoned by horn calls to form their shield walls across the hilltop, answering calls came echoing out of the still dark chasms below the falls. Kermorven nodded in satisfaction and pointed. Up the far flank of the vale wound what looked like a serpent of golden lights. It was the army of Karis, hurrying up from its warm fires to take its appointed place among the northern hills, and close the siege of the gate.
I commanded them to keep well back from the fortress, in the shelter of the hills, until any actual assault, he remarked.
That was wise, answered Elof, though inwardly he writhed at the thought of what must follow.
It gives us a freer hand, and I think we will need it.
Kermorven nodded.
I fear you are right. She will scorn to answer us if we seek to talk with her now. Each moment may be a gain to her. Any one might be crucial. I will not deny Lohi a chance of terms, if only for Kara's sake. But first, we must make her feel the power you have given us. Make ready, then, and I will sound the call.
Elof stood rooted as the tall man strode away, feeling helpless, feeling as if the ice flowed through him, veins and vitals frozen to crystal. Ills, oddly hesitant, touched his arm, and when he made no response, she looped her own through it. He smiled at her thinly. "You're slipping, my lady. When he kissed you, you didn't hack him on the shins." Ills shrugged. "He learns, that long lad. Decidedly, he learns." "Would you kick me?" For answer, Ills twisted around and pulled his face down to her a moment, then, as swiftly, released him. Kermorvan's horns, marching out before the host, were sounding a single braying challenge, and the first full rays of the sun were blazing up over the eastern rim of the world.
Now, go! Go, and may our work blister the pale hide off her.
That first call had set the soldiers swiftly to work. They laid down those great shields, upon which Elof and every smith of Kermorvan's and Ilsa's realms, from apprentice to master, had labored through many long months. The remorseless heat and sweat of that time came back to him as he watched, but also a growing thrill of excitement. Those who had lost or damaged their shields in the battle had gathered more from the slain, and from the store of spare ones they had brought. Now they were unscrewing the heavy bosses of the shields. Behind those were the bolts which held on their wooden grips, and their covers of sturdy fabric. Off came the grips, and were laid aside. Then off came the covers, and a swift golden shimmer seemed to play among the ranks. Quickly then the shields were laid down, and the grips refastened. Then the horns sounded another call, and because this was a set and practiced drill, the whole army picked up its reversed shields almost as one man. Cursing sergeants ran to berate the inevitable few who had failed, but also to assist. Speed was the all-important thing here. Behind Elof stood some of the few Caris folk who had chosen to follow Kermorvan rather than the rest. They were mostly young and hardy, and two of them, to his surprise, were among the few women who had come out to fight. They had stayed close to Rock because he could talk to them easily in their own dialect, and they were plying him with puzzled questions. But all he would say was, "Do you watch?" And it was not such a bad answer, Elof thought, for even as the next call sounded and the ranks reformed, some earnest of their purpose could not help but appear. The ice wall nearest them came suddenly alive, shot with fleeting shimmers and sparkles of golden radiance. Beautiful, but so bright one hardly dared look at it, for it left blazing streaks of purple in one's sight. One of the Caris men gasped and swore in astonishment, then fell silent as Elof turned to him with what must have been a death's head grin. "Well?" Elof demanded. "Oh, a mirror!" stammered the Caris men, in horrified fascination. "A mirror of the sun! A burning glass!" "Aye, lad," said Rock with grim satisfaction. "That's just exactly what it is. The most mirrors there's ever been. Or the biggest, however you care to look at it. But not just any mirror turns the sun better. Gathering rather than scatter turning a blow better than a flat one. And an inward curving mirror turns the sun better, gathering rather than scattering the light. It was Hela's own job trying to find a shape good for both, let me tell you. But Master Elof did it." For long moments the Caris men and women watched the great burst of light pulse and shimmer upon the fortress wall, awed and fascinated. But evidently one of the women was also deeply disturbed by something. "Well?" demanded Elof again. "Speak up, woman. I won't bite." "It's just that, even though the mirrors gather the light, can it really be enough against ice such as that? True, there are many, but they would still all need to cast the light close together into one single narrow place. How may they aim all for that one small target, for the time they will need?
Elof nodded gravely. There might be the makings of smiths in you folks still. As you say, men's arms weaken, their aim wavers. We could not depend on it for a moment. So within that metal, we master smiths set virtues, potencies, and attributes fitting to both its tasks. For what fits a shield better than to hold firm with its fellows in the shield wall? Did you wonder at how tight ours held? If they had been made of lodestone, they would not have held faster, nor moved more as one. Yet when needed, they could be plucked apart again without effort. And so it was with them now, or it will be when all is prepared, and the command is given. Rock, by your leave? Rock nodded curtly, and turning to Elof's mount, he handed him down the great shield slung from its saddle bow. The grips had already been reversed. Elof tore the cover from it, revealing a surface still mirror bright after its long voyage. That was a work of virtues also, and of subtle alloys. This is one of the master shields, he said quietly. There are others here and there among the host, but they will command only if this and others of greater precedence are turned from the sun. We tested this weapon when we had only a few shields, where the master shield's light falls, all follow. 1 or 2, even 10, do little. But 30, under a clear noon sun, could fire a tree, given time. Or 100, a man. And though some, and their wielders, are lost to us, we have, what would you say, some 8,000 still? He held the shield to his lips, and they heard him murmur a few words in a tongue of old. Only his friends knew their origins. Ein here, Elof, Hans, Stein, Stalans, Mars, Olnir, Elof. It was a phrase the master smith had first shown him, the words of power that had governed the shaping of Tarnhelm and the sword, and even of himself. For in one word of ambiguity, signifying both one alone and smith, they had given him his name. A lone thing gains power surpassing, when joined among many by a smith. So it had been with him. Without his friends, what would he have been? And so it was with this. He cried out suddenly, and brandished the shield aloft. From along the slope above Kermorven answered him, and other commanders about the hill. Then slowly, carefully, Elof angled his shield to catch the sun as it lifted above the horizon, and cast it into the heart of that amorphous glow. And as he did so, he caught his breath, for with a sudden, brilliant flicker, like coals shifting in a fire, all 8,000 shields, each the height and breadth of a man, tilted to follow him. For a moment, it was as if the sun had stretched forth, not the long and lazy beams of dawning, but a limb of its own blazing substance, a great arm of flame that struck against that glittering wall. An image of fire like a living thing danced mockingly upon it. For long seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Then, as Elof's arm settled and grew steadier, and the other shields followed it ever more closely, the dancing image grew finer, more concentrated, impossible to look at. Even the reflected radiance of it was dazzling,
and the air about them, that had been so frosty a moment since, grew slowly warm as spring. It settled and steadied until it seemed that the mirrors had captured the sun itself and sent it out to fight. For upon that bright surface there formed a perfect image of the blazing disk high above. In that very moment there came a deafening, explosive report, and across the face of the ice a great white line sprang out, a crack that coursed and spread across the shining surface in a mad fusillade of sound, thrusting out others like living roots, crazing and opaquing all its transparency. From the heart of that blazing light there came a sudden frenzied shriek, the cry of the steam that boiled out through the cracks. But not fast enough, for with a sudden dull roar, a great chunk of the ice was blasted out by its pressure, and went crashing down in a mad, shattering music onto the frozen falls below. A wide, wolfish cheer went up from the host, and Elof, his face taut with the concentration, began very delicately to swing the beam of sunfire around towards the center of the tower. He had played such games as this in his childhood, in his few precious moments of idleness, turning the sun with a bright flake of mica or metal. It was strange to turn the light in such deadly earnest now. He brought down one of those great ice pillars, but a warning shout from above showed him the activity upon the upper reaches of the castle. Men were moving, files of black-clad warriors pouring out of the gates onto the paths above the ridge that led around the slopes of the pillars of the gate and up towards the army above. He winced, hating Louhi more than ever for what she was making him do. Slowly, very carefully, he began to shift his shield once more, as Kermorven, breathless, came bounding down to his side. "Easy now," breathed the king. "There's time enough, and with luck, we need only give them a slight lesson." "I hope so," gritted Elof, fighting down his nausea. But it was too late for regrets. The first mass of warriors had reached the hill's edge. So had the light. Flame and fire flashed up as it touched. There was no chill in the bodies of men to match that of the ice. Like heedless insects, they rushed into that burst of sunfire, and like insects, they blazed up, withered, and dwindled to a charred nothingness. Those at the light's edge were not instantly consumed, but leaped and capered as it touched them, and burst into little pillars of flame. Those behind fell back, blinded, and found their hair and clothes catch about them. This way and that they rushed, fell on the steep slope, and rolled crazily downhill through the melting snow till they fell like blazing starstones out into the abyss. The disk of light played searingly back and forth across the hillsides, splitting stones, steaming snow, and blasting the black earth beneath to white powder. There was no shelter from it, for even those who sought to spring up, shrieking as air like the breath of some immense furnace wrapped itself around them, flaying their skin and blistering their lungs. The light began to tremble then, till Kermorven put a steadying hand on the edge of the master shield, countering Elof's unsteadiness. But it was more also than his foes could stand. From shameful defeat they had fled to the fastness of the gate. That to them embodied the ice's conquering invulnerability, only to find it menaced also. and themselves driven forth to perish against a force they could not understand, let alone fight. That point of sunfire seemed to them more fearsome and awful than any of the terrors and wonders by which the ice had fastened its thralls upon them. A greater, more devouring horror than all the dark rituals it demanded. It broke more than their onrush. It broke them. They obeyed that ancient enthrall and died instantly, or they cast it off and fled. Still they streamed from the doors of the gate, but no longer in any order, and not towards the shield walls on the distant slopes. This way and that they ran, scuttling like pale things from beneath an overturned stone, no longer thralls of anything save their own terror. In pride and despair, some flung themselves down from the heights, or ran headlong into the flame, but most fled incontinently into the vale or the hills once more. And they perished in the hardships of the days that followed. A few who kept some shred of sanity fled southward, around and behind the slopes where Kermorvan's army stood, for there neither ice nor sun could reach them. But there the ravens were waiting, for Kermorvan had stationed them against such a chance. A few offered fight, and were cut down. The remainder were gathered in, and by Kermorvan's command, well treated. They were no longer a threat to anyone. In one blazing day of wrath, the cold grip of their people had been tried in an ordeal of fire, and in that fire it melted away. So also melted the ice upon the walls of the gate, for Elof, glad to be free of such slaughter, had already swung back his shield, and after it he drew the sun, as if like Raven in the old tale he had stolen it for the succor of mankind. Against the tallest of all the glassy pillars he flung it like a coin of white-hot gold, and ice and image shattered together, cracking, splintering, exploding outwards in a cloud of flying sepulchres. Downward he played it, and cracks ran ahead of it, all the long length of the pillar. Great showers of shattered whiteness came plummeting after, fell through the beam, and blasted back up as steam. Then, with a tormented moaning crunch, the whole top-heavy column blew free of the main sheet and tilted out into emptiness. With the same momentous deliberation as a glacier face falling into the sea, it toppled away and down into the valley below. It struck the frozen falls with a ringing crash of glassy thunder, rebounded off with sickening slowness, and rolled down the flank of the vale, crushing a great swath through the pines, and plummeting at last onto the frozen surface of one of the lakes, splitting it into fragments and raising a huge fountain of dark water. Heads turned to watch, for that was an awesome fall. But their shields seemed to stir in their hands, for Elof, with a savage grimace of triumph, was already swinging the beam back against the patch of bared stone. Back and forth it coursed, and as the cold stone grew swiftly warm, the ice began to melt outwards. A growing stream of meltwater poured down, and the searing air boiled into the gap. Cracks exploded along the wall, and suddenly, with great tearing crashes, pillar after pillar began to tear free under its own weight and drop down into the chasm. All the army of Morvenhall cheered wildly as they felt the power in their own hands blast those daunting walls to nothing. Even Kermorven was yelling in delight, crying out ancestral vows of vengeance for the raising of Morven. Only Elof's face was grim, a mask as set as any Ekwesh shaman's, feeling the might of the sun tearing at the heart of his foe. He caught Kermorven's eye and called, "Is that enough of a taste for her, think you?" Kermorven nodded and signaled to his men, and through the rumble of falling ice, the bright-voiced horns rang clear. For long moments it seemed as if there would be no response from within the gate. It stood there, silent and unmoving, while its shattered ice continued to sizzle and melt and fall away from the heated stone. Angrily, Kermorven signaled that the call should be repeated more loudly, and his heralds blew till they were scarlet-faced. As the sound died, they all heard quite clearly the thin, cold music of icicles vibrating in sympathy. But still, there was no response. Elof frowned. He tilted his shield with unhurried care, and the sun disk began to creep slowly up towards the still untouched crown of the gate. As it settled on the rim of the first balcony, a great cloud of steam arose, and meltwater poured down in a sudden stream. Then, at last, from within the battlements, a single horn rang out in answer. Elof stared, cursed, and the light juddered violently. Within the very heart of that blazing orb, full in its glare, a door had opened, and onto the central dais of the balcony, raised high upon stairs, stepped a majestic figure. About her blonde hair the fire danced in a corona of light. Against the sleek whiteness of her robe, that sunblast shimmered and glowed. Yet neither she nor the shadowy shapes behind her shriveled or vanished, or seemed in any way affected. She leaned out, resting her hands lightly upon the balustrade before her, and a swift whiteness seemed to course along it, spreading as milk whitens water, glittering as it grew thicker, radiating cold flashes of rainbow hues from the true sun overhead. As it ran out along the outer battlements, men filed out behind it, true, tall warriors of the Ekwesh, but with their black shields painted only with plain bars of white. Elof knew them at once for men of the hidden clan, deepest and most fanatical votaries of the ice. And behind them other shapes came lumbering, nightmarish, inhuman, trolls and worse beasts of shadow. Elof had no eyes for them, for he had glimpsed another, slighter shape, bare-limbed and slender in a corsetlet of bright mail, helmless so that her short, dark hair showed. She came to Louhi's side as she beckoned, suffering an arm to be laid about her slim shoulders, and inclined her head to rest it against the white-clad breast. "Well, brave men of Morvenhall," called a smoothly mocking voice, "what of all your brave deeds now?"
"What indeed?" Kermorven shouted back. "We have defeated your army, driven away your rear guard, and shattered your walls of ice. If you do not surrender and submit yourself to us, we will melt the very stone beneath you."
The laugh that drifted down was sweet and silvery. "Will you indeed? And can you now? See I bathe in this brightest light of yours, for the heat is not in it that can burn me. I drink such petty fires, and make them my own. Ask the clever smithling who made you your toy. And so what then, my brave man-child? You must move swiftly, remember, for your power dies with the day's end, and the night is mine. What then, man-child? What then? Looks of dismay flickered across men's faces, much as the heat across their shields. But Kermorven smiled calmly.
What then? Another dawn, my Lady Louhi. And by that dawn, you will be alone, and your life at risk. Can all the ice stand thus against men, with such power as this in their hands? Whatever a winter achieves, the first sons of spring will undo more swiftly. Your power is slow, my lady, so slow that but for its strength it would be laughable. And now we have found a greater. You are defeated.
The bright peal of laughter that drifted down to them sounded disturbingly true. There was almost an affectionate ring to it, delighting as a child might in the absurd follies of a child. I? Defeated? Believe me, my fair lordling, those of my kind are not so easily defeated, nor lightly slain. The great ice has come and gone many 1,000 times since this world of ours was gathered out of dust and given to us to direct. Do you really think your toy can change that at a few strokes? But let us suppose it might. Have you thought what must follow? She shook her blonde hair till it foamed about her shoulders and fell across her breasts. Of course you have not. But, man-child, the ice you would melt, what will become of it? It will not simply vanish, will it? It must turn to water, of course. As much water. And what then? Her voice hardened suddenly and became queenly, regal, stern as cold steel, mirroring the light that played still about her. Fool! Shall I tell you what must happen? Into the seas that vastness of water shall flow, as all waters must, and swell them mightily, and they shall rise and overwhelm the land, and with it shall sink all the petty realms of men, and the last pitiful hopes of your ill-starred race. Destroy the ice, and you destroy yourselves. A shudder of dismay fell across the army at her words, and the disregard she still showed for the consuming sunfire. Rumor rumbled among the ranks, but it was Kermorven's turn to laugh. A broad, confident chuckle, not at all like his rare outbursts of mirth. He meant it to be heard.
Lady, he laughed. You have learned to threaten well, but you threaten too cleverly for simple folk like us. If the ice cannot overwhelm all the land as ice, then why should it do any better as water?
Answering guffaws broke out among the ranks, and the mood of the army was turned again in an instant. But Elof did not laugh. He could not take his eyes from that slender figure by Loki's side, all but eclipsed by her brilliant light. "No, lady," said Kermorven then, growing more grimly serious with every word. "I fear nobody believes you. But I tell you this, even if I did, still all your threats would not divert me the breadth of one of your fair golden hairs from my purpose." His words echoed against the bared stone, and the tall woman swayed suddenly as if struck in the body. Kermorven caught Elof by the shoulder and said sharply, "Above her head." Elof hissed his agreement and tilted back his shield with minute precision. The sun settled on the upper galleries as if it was caught between the high towers of Caris, and their icy sheathing exploded. Steam boiled out around the people on the battlements, and Lohi had to throw herself aside to avoid a rain of jagged fragments. "Stop it!" they heard her scream, stumbling up. "Stop it!" She was raging now, all pretense of suavity gone. "Mindless vermin! Can you not even see? All that you have, all that you are, you owe to us! Our chance creation, a byblow, an accident of our power!" With savage precision, Elof shone the sunlight closer. Then he stopped abruptly as he saw her hurl a figure forward against the balustrade. It was Kara, looking out with wide, alarmed eyes among the boiling steam, but making no effort to struggle. The sun's image shook and danced wildly in his quivering grasp. "You!" yelled Lohi, and he had no doubt whom she meant. "Master Smith! It was your mind dreamed up this pretty toy. Who else among your verminkind would have the wit? And it's your hand that sways it now, I'll be bound. Well, do you turn that meddling hand away from me, away from the ice, or you'll see its power at work indeed. This creature you claim to care for, though little she thinks of you now, what of her when your beam is upon us? I need only lift my hand from her, and she'll burn to ashes as swift as any common mortal. And what then? We may not die, we higher born, if we are unbodied against our will, but we do change, and change in the changing. She is weak, and change hangs over her, a change neither you nor I can guess. Bring it upon her, little Master Smith, and how will you ever find her again within the puny lifespan of a man? And would she know you if you did? Elof shot a horrified glance at Kermorven, but even as he did so, and before the king could answer, the whole great army of shields parted as one, as if they moved of their own accord, dispersing the light in many directions. Elof bowed his head. Your will is in them, said Grimorvan somberly. When it is so strong, they heed it even as it forms. You must turn it again, my friend, or we are lost. But there must be something we can do, cried Elof in dire anguish. What then? Grimorvan demanded bleakly. Rescue her? But does she want to be rescued? Look at her. She might strike you down as soon as Lohi would if you tried. Elof ground his teeth. She would want it. She will. Can I but win her away again? You should know there are shackles upon her, though you cannot see them. I know, said the king bitterly. But can I set her, against all the lives at risk, all we have spent already, all the future of this world? If you cannot nerve yourself to it, I could not blame you. But I hold a master shield, and if I must... Kermorven! cried Elof, desperate with anger and alarm. The ruin of all that is yours would not deter you, you say. But who are you to command the ruin of mine? Rock and Il sprang up, for they had seen his hand drop to the silver hilt. Grimorvan did not answer. Instead, he said this. We have a minute, while Lohi is still gathering her wits. A swift strike at her might free Kara. It is a better chance than none, at all events. I could crawl close, offered Rock hoarsely, with our best archers. Fetch down the bitch with an arrow. Kermorvan shook his head. They are watching for that, those guards. Elof, what could reach that balcony in time? Catapult? No, too inaccurate. If only I still had my hammer. But hurling that into such great heat might awaken a worse danger. My wings now, but we've no fire. A thin, faint smile hovered about Kermorvan's lips. Do we need it? Elof slapped hand to palm and swore. Within minutes he was strapping his wings about him, and Ilse, with infinite care, was directing a growing number of shields around and onto his corsetlet. For long moments he felt the flaring radiance envelop him. His sight flamed scarlet, and his skin prickled agonizingly. Then it faded, and his broad pinions drove the searing air from about him, beating with a promise of strength they had never before known. His whole being seemed to tingle with energy, and he grew impatient for his sight to clear. When it did, Kermorvan stood before him, in full armor and helm. Can you bear a heavy burden thus? Kara, you mean? Twice over, with ease. Kermorvan nodded, lacing his helmet tight for battle. Then you can bear me also. You may need me to occupy that guard. But you're the king. Of where, save for my friends? You more than any, perhaps. And Kara was my friend also. The gray gold blade slid from its scabbard. And in truth, do you know any other warrior who would serve? Elof, half smiling, shook his head quickly. and his wings spread high above his shoulders. Grimorvan hooked an arm about his neck. Elof caught him by his broad belt, and they lifted. Il swung back the beam to distract his foes. Elof's wings thrashed like a storm wind, and they soared up towards the looming heights of the high gate. Lean though he looked, Grimorvan was a heavy man, but the smith's strength and the power of the wings bore them both up easily and fast. The wind burned in their faces with the speed of their rush, and the arrows loosed by the guards above flew harmlessly in their wake. In a few fast breaths, they were crossing the balustrade just below the dais steps. Out of sight of those above, a melee of startled guards rushed in on them, and Grimorvan, loosing his grip, dropped lightly onto the balcony. His feet skidded upon the rimed tiles, but in the very act of recovering his balance, he hewed the first comer's head from his shoulders. Elof angled his wings and bowled down 3 more, one right over the balustrade. The others dropped back, shields raised, and Grimorvan sprang at them. Elof, drawing Gorthar, was turning to speed up the steps when he heard a scream of wrath from above, and from below a warning blare of horn calls. A speeding shadow fell across him, and he twisted around in alarm, squinting up at the dark shape that dived out of the sun's glare toward him. In that blaze of light, he judged his distance ill. His first thought was only to warn. His second, that he was responsible for the king's safety, at whatever cost. With that thought, the shadow was on him, and the collision sent him spinning around in the air, his ears ringing with the terrible cry of pain. Gorthar was wrenched from his fingers. He saw something plummet past him and crash upon the balcony tiles, and heard from above him an echoing scream and a peal of sobbing laughter. Then, as he rolled upward and regained control, he himself screamed at what he saw there. It had the ghastly clarity of a dream. The slender form of a woman arched high against the sun. The wings that were her arms flung back from her outthrust breast, and standing in it among a flood of scarlet, the shining hilt of a black-bladed sword. It seemed an endless age of agony and horror that she hung there before him. Then it was as if she crumpled up around the blade that transfixed her. She toppled sideways, her wings folding about her like a shroud, and even as he leaped out to her, crying her name, she fell away in a cloud of black feathers into the deep vale below. After her he sped, so fast the wind whipped the very tears from his eyes, but it was hopeless. For all that long fall, Elof's eyes never left her, but of what thoughts passed behind them, no chronicle can tell. Light but swift she fell, the merest speck plummeting into the distance, lost to him in an instant against the dark waters of a new opened lake, still churning with the icefall. A frozen moment passed, and a speck of white leaped up upon its surface. A rage of whiteness swirled there a moment, and Kara was gone. In a void he whirled, and a void opened within him, a raging turmoil of agonized emptiness and loss. The shouts he heard he heeded without understanding, less will in him than in the least thing of his devising. Back against the balustrade he crashed, and would have fallen had hard hands not hauled him in. There was Grimorvan, his mail spattered with blood, Ohi's guards scattered, writhing, or still about his feet, but in his eyes a greater horror dwelt. "You were right," whispered Elof. "She attacked." But Grimorvan, his lips set hard and gray as cold granite, was lifting something from among a mass of splintered tiles. He hefted it a moment, his head bowed, and stretched out his hand to Elof. In it was Elof's hammer. Light and dark seemed to spin around in Elof's head, forming a cruel mask of a face, stern, gray-bearded, cruelly lined, laughing a bitter laugh that echoed into infinite emptiness, mocking the twisted web of destiny that twined there. It was the face of the Watcher, the image of Vade. It was not his own, and yet somehow he knew that it laughed for him, because it had never learned to weep. But he himself, it is said, rose shakily on his knees, staring at the hammer that Kara, in one last defiant act of love, had risked her existence to bring him. Risked, but she had never dreamed the risk was from him. A sudden slash of pain cut through his legs. All thoughts save one died and shriveled in his mind. All fire save one in his heart. He looked up and saw there another, fair, deadly fair as the shining summits of the ice itself, and she too was laughing, no less terrible, leaning far out over the whitened balustrade and brandishing her fist at him. Within him a cold knot of compassion twisted, for she too had loved, in her way. Had he not had Kermorven to protect? With a howl of sheer animal pain, he seized the tall man by belt and arm, and sprang up and out with him over the balustrade, as if he meant to dash them both to their deaths below. But his wings flung out, and back towards the blazing shield wall he swooped. At the slope's foot he glided low and dropped his burden, crying out in a great voice, "Down, all of you, behind the shields, and cover your eyes. Do not look!" Then high into the middle airs he arrowed, and even as he rose, the shields of his craft seemed to come alive in the hands of their wielders, twisting like serpents till the sunfire they ensnared found focus upon him. To the few who dared look a moment longer, he seemed to vanish for a moment, as if he had met the fate of so many that day. Yet Kermorven, as he sped back among his ranks, saw him still hanging there at the heart of that glare, shining like a shape new cast in white-hot gold. On the balcony of the gate the Equesh too stared at that terrible sight, and many cast themselves headlong, hiding their eyes. But she whom they cried to, tall and pale, made no move to look away. The white gems of the corsetlet drank in the whole force of that fire, and from them the gem of his gauntlet, till his whole arm blazed with the terrible radiance of contained power. A moment more, and it would have consumed him. But in that moment he acted. Louhi shrank back. She screamed aloud, and her arms flew up as if to ward off a blow. It availed her nothing. Out from that glowing shape, as the fingers flashed apart, burst all that pent-up force, in a single incandescent shape, and in its path, straight and fast as if to shatter mountains, flew the devastating hammer. Kermorven, forewarned, reached the shield wall and threw himself down among his followers, crouched down with covered eyes. Yet the flash of light they saw, even through tight-shut lids, so white it seemed to burn deep into the depths of their minds. Thunder crashed about them. The very air seized them and shook them and threw them half scorched upon the steaming earth, as it twitched and shivered beneath them like the hide of a branded beast. The drumbeats of avalanches resounded through earth and sky as the bases of cliffs and slope crumbled and slid away beneath that single overwhelming blow, that violent impact upon the face of the world. Yet through it, above it, louder than any voice they had ever heard, it seemed to all who were there they heard that last desperate cry echoing still, a shriek of anguish and defeat and ultimate, infinite loss. Like lightning, it leaped from sky to earth and back again, and rove the air asunder. But whether they heard it with their ears or in their hearts, few cared to say. Elof heard it. A searing blast hurled him skyward so high, so fast, the breath was crushed from him, and when at last he could breathe again, the air lanced thin and cold through his straining lungs. It stung his scorched skin unbearably, and the sunlight, brighter, sharper, fell on him like a sleeting shower of needles, as if to flay him for his presumption in having channeled its power. Something was happening to him, something frightening, as if the shrieking winds were shredding the flesh from his bones like leaves from dead branches, as if he was being torn apart and reformed. He groped for understanding, but that convulsion of nature, and ringing through it that last terrible scream, had shivered his thoughts like thin ice. His wings had shielded him. They were ragged now. They hardly bore him, and yet he felt unable to fall. It was as if only fragments of him were left to float upon the wind, a ragged shred through which a clear light could shine. But it was a strange light, at once limpid and fiery, and it seemed to well up out of the infinite abyss below. Visions it bore with it, visions and truths, clear sights of things that had been, that were taking shape even now, or that might yet be, all weaving together in one vast coil. In wonder he perceived that coil, and gazing upon it, knew that slowly but surely, as he once had crafted a sword, the many strands were being twisted into greater strands, and those strands hammered together into one bright, infinite shaping, one awesome work of craft. No vision lingered, though he grasped at them as might a child at butterflies. He glimpsed them only, as one might through the gaps in a tattered tapestry draped across a wide casement. But he saw enough to grasp one truth. He himself was that tapestry. Seconds passed, perhaps, before he knew he was falling once more, but they might as well have been hours. As he turned over in the air, the clearest vision of all came to him. His tortured eyes, and more than his eyes, looked down upon the churning sea, scattered with jagged shards of ice, fragmented, melting, and at its margins a great scorched scar upon the land. There the fortress of the High Gate had stood, but it was gone, and the very ridge it was built upon. The mountains that flanked it still stood, but their faces had collapsed in rubble into the yawning gap, and through that gap, bounded like a horse newly freed from harness and stall, the sea came rushing in. Down it crashed from heights to depths in falls and rapids of awesome height, tumbling the shattered mountain ribs like fine gravel, spitting brilliant spray skyward as if to mock the force that had held it in icy bounds. Into the upper reaches of the Yeskienus, still frozen, it spilled, and further downstream the ice bulged up from beneath and exploded into floating shards as the dark waters swelled. He looked down after them, and to his sight, time and space merged and became one. Down the river of days he followed their surging progress, and watched the ending of a land. Wider they spread, smoothly, slowly, and up bank and barrier the darkly gleaming line rose. There was no wave, no wash of devastation, only a smooth, slow devouring. Waterside and island seemed to shrink and sink down into the sparkling maw of the waters with scarcely a wash of foam. Grasses waved their heads to the flow as they had to the wind, till they were swallowed up. Trees at the riverside stood straight, even as the waters climbed their trunks. Only at the last, like men awakening in a sinking ship, did they flail their dark heads frantically. Their fear availed them nothing. They too sank. But down to the haunts of men that fear was swiftly borne, by the waves that lapped at wharf and wall, boomed at water gates and shook bridges. Bells rang from tower to tower, bronze voices that sang their warning peal all along the shores of that once mighty country, till it seemed that the whole land quivered. Back and forth they swung, as if the waves themselves were ringing them. Even in the horns of the bull they swung, in the towers that crowned the strength of Caris, telling of a subtle foe that neither outermost wall nor highest bastion could bar, of the cool darkness that even now was filling the docks, swinging ships at anchor, swelling channel and canals like riven veins. With many voices they sang, but one word only was their message to all men, from furthest farmstead to the streets of Caris the city itself, and that was flee. It was heeded. Those fled who could, and most fled in time. Men who had boats took to them, but large numbers were sunk by the frantic fugitives who sought to struggle aboard. Others fled mounted or on foot, in carts and carriages, or with what conveyance they might, but it was little enough they managed to take with them. Many farmers drove their beasts inland, but some not far enough, for at the first the Yeskienus rose as fast as a weary man might run. It met the tributaries and drove back their flows. Into the crevices of the fire mountains it spilled, recoiled in steam, and patiently, insistently, washed once more. The defenses that Elof had created with such care it touched, tried, and found wanting. Into their depths it sent a probing tendril, and even as the tiny garrison escaped, it was lapping the dark blood from its rough-hewn stone. Down it came to a green island whose crown still smoked and smoldered, and the little mammoths among the rushes squealed and trampled their way to the high ground. Nobody dared set foot there now, and they were safe. Wider and wider it spread. That great river, no longer a river. Men fled to north and to south, as the sundering waters rose between them. They saved their lives, but the land and realm of which once they had been a part was engulfed at their heels, and lost beyond recall. The peril of the ice was lifted from the world, but upon the land it had corrupted and upon the city at its heart, the mightiest that then was in all the world, a still greater cleansing was come. But already Elof's eyes were gazing far beyond it, for the hunger of the waters was not yet sated, and the cleansing not yet at an end.